It's May 7th, 2011. Kaimana Airport in eastern Indonesia. On the ground, it looks like a normal day. But up in the sky, Merpati Nusantara Flight 8968 is fighting a battle that it can't win. Rain pours, thick clouds surround the aircraft and visibility is almost zero. Without modern landing aids, the crew must rely solely on their instincts. Inside the cockpit, tension rises as alarms warn of dangerous terrain ahead. Every moment brings them closer to disaster. The lives of 25 people are now in the hands of the pilots. Will they find the runway in time, or will this flight end in tragedy? Let's find out. This is the story of Merpati Nusantara Flight 8968. The Merpati Nusantara crew, consisting of 55-year-old Captain Perwandi Wayu and 36-year-old First Officer Paul Knapp, reported for duty at the airport in Jayapura, the largest city in West Papua. They were scheduled to fly 6 sectors around eastern Indonesia, departing Jayapura for Nabire, Kaimana and Sorong, then returning to Kaimana and Nabire and finishing the day in Biak. The aircraft they were flying was a Xi'an Modern Arc 60, MA-60, a Chinese-made twin turboprop, similar to the ATR-72, with a capacity for 62 passengers. Despite being assembled in China, the MA-60 was based on a Soviet Antonov AN-24 design, modified with Western engines and avionics. This particular plane, built in 2007, had entered service with Merpati in 2010 and had completed fewer than 800 flights. Since the MA-60 was new to the airline, neither pilot had much experience with it. Captain Wayu had logged 24,470 flight hours on various aircraft types, but had only 199 hours on the MA-60, which he had begun flying in January of that year. It's unclear whether he was disappointed to be transferred to the smaller, less advanced MA-60 after spending 16 years flying the larger Fokker 100 regional jets for Merpati. First Officer Knapp, in contrast, was much less experienced. A newcomer to aviation, he had only 370 flight hours total and had been placed on the MA-60 immediately after completing his training. With 234 hours on the MA-60, he had slightly more experience on the plane than Captain Wayu. The first 3 legs of the flight proceeded without issue, and by 12:30 p.m. local time, the crew was in Sorong, a city of about 250,000 people on the far western tip of West Papua. The next leg was a 60-minute flight to Kaimana, a village of around 13,000 people, which was the largest settlement within a 200-kilometer radius. Kaimana's small single-runway airport was the only link the town had to the outside world. At 12:45 p.m., Merpati Nusantara Flight 8968 departed Sorong for Kaimana, carrying 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants, 2 mechanics, and 19 passengers. The pilots had been briefed on the weather in Kaimana: intermittent rain, broken clouds at 1,400 feet, and 8 kilometers of visibility at ground level. This posed a challenge because Kaimana's rudimentary airport lacked any navigation or landing aids, meaning there were no published instrument approach procedures for low visibility conditions. The only option for landing was a visual approach, where the pilot must spot the runway and manually align the plane. However, the minimum requirements for a visual approach were 5 kilometers of visibility and a cloud base of at least 1,500 feet, conditions that were not met when Flight 8968 left Sorong. After cruising at 15,500 feet, Flight 8968 was cleared to descend into Kaimana, entering uncontrolled airspace, where the pilots had full discretion. Although Kaimana Airport had a control tower, it was staffed by an AFIS officer who could only provide advisory information, not direct instructions. By this time, the weather had worsened, with rain clouds and reduced visibility now down to 3 kilometers. Captain Wayu, managing the radio while First Officer Knapp flew, asked the AFIS officer for advice on which end of the runway had better visibility. The officer suggested the south end, so Wayu ordered Knapp to fly south and approach runway 01, passing over Kaimana Bay. As they flew past the airport, the clouds closed in. Knapp, concerned about being too far out, asked Wayu if he should turn to line up with the runway, despite not being able to see it. Wayu instructed him to keep flying south until they found a clear spot, but less than 30 seconds later they began the base turn, with Wayu lowering the landing gear and extending the flaps, preparing for landing. Captain Wayu had doubts about completing the approach as soon as the turn began, given the poor visibility. Hoping for better conditions, he called the AFIS officer again and learned that visibility had dropped to 2 kilometers with rain over the runway, although the final approach was still visible from the tower. Shortly after, First Officer Knapp reported seeing the island through a gap in the clouds. Despite still not seeing the runway, this gave Wayu enough confidence to proceed, even though visibility was below the legal minimum for visual approach. Aware of the risk, Wayu showed signs of stress, mistakenly announcing flaps 25, a non-existent setting on the MA60. Knapp continued the approach, flying toward the only visible part of the island, the headland southeast of the runway. Wayu ordered a reduction in power, then disconnected the autopilot 20 seconds later. At this point, Wayu, who had flown to Kaimana many times, took control from Knapp without explanation, despite the dangers of doing so close to landing. Moments later, the EGPWS alarmed, announcing minimums, as they reached their minimum altitude of 580 feet. Aware that they were too low to continue without seeing the runway, Wayu asked 3 times if Knapp could spot it, but each time Knapp responded negatively. As Wayu skirted the headland, he attempted to align with the runway, but never spotted it due to the rain showers. At 376 feet, he decided to abandon the approach. Pushing the throttle forward with one hand and pulling the nose up with the other, Flight 8968 began to climb. Knowing the terrain to the right, he sharply turned left to head out over the bay. He also ordered First Officer Knapp to retract the flaps and landing gear, which was promptly done. A brief landing gear warning sounded, but was ignored. At this point, the plane was in a dangerous situation. The right engine was only at 82% torque, and the left engine at 70% due to Wayu's improper throttle use. Worse, neither engine was set to go-around power, which should have been 95% torque. On the MA60, engine power is controlled by selecting different operating modes: max cruise, max climb, max continuous, or toga, take off, go around, each providing more power. During cruise, a lower power setting is used to avoid engine wear. But during approach, the toga button should have been pressed to ensure maximum power was available for a go-around. Neither pilot had done so, leaving the engines operating in the lower cruise mode. When Wayu initiated the go-around without applying go-around power, the plane lost airspeed rapidly, dropping from 155 knots to 125 knots. Simultaneously, the flaps were retracted to 0 degrees, causing a further loss of lift. This was worsened by Wayu's steep left turn, which reached 38 degrees outside normal limits, but not enough to trigger a bank angle warning. The combination of low speed, the steep turn, and the premature flap retraction left the plane unable to maintain lift and climb. With the plane still banked steeply, the nose dropped, and the aircraft began to descend from a peak altitude of 585 feet. The EGPWS issued a warning. Terrain. But neither pilot responded or attempted to recover. Just 13 seconds after the go-around began, Flight 8968 crashed nose first into Kaimana Bay, killing all 25 on board. The crash occurred just 800 meters southwest of the runway threshold, but the AFIS officer was unaware due to trees blocking his view. A witness called an off-duty AFIS officer, who then alerted the tower. The general alarm was raised, and the airport's 4 firefighters, along with the town's ambulance and 18 other personnel, rushed to the site by boat. However, when they arrived, they found only floating debris and no survivors. The plane had broken into 5 pieces, lying under 7 to 15 meters of water. Divers later discovered only mangled bodies in the wreckage. Contributing to the crash was a severe lack of cockpit discipline and communication. The pilots barely spoke during the flight, with most of the cockpit voice recording consisting of silence, broken only by Captain Wayu giving orders to First Officer Knapp. This lack of communication created an unhealthy cockpit environment, and the most concerning moment was Wayu's last-minute takeover of the controls. This indicated a lack of trust in Knapp despite his inexperience. Given that Wayu had 65 times more flying hours than Knapp, the first officer would likely have been reluctant to challenge his captain. In addition to poor communication, the cockpit voice recording revealed no evidence that the pilots completed the approach briefing, checklists, or descent procedures. This oversight was likely why the engine remained in cruise mode when it should have been switched to toga for a go-around. A key factor in the loss of control was the premature retraction of the flaps, which appeared to be caused by Captain Wayu reverting to familiar procedures under stress. On the Xi'an MA-60, the proper procedure for a go-around calls for flap retraction only after reaching a stable speed of at least 135 knots and an altitude of 400 feet, conditions that were not met when Wayu ordered flaps up. However, on the Fokker 100, a plane Wayu had flown for over 16 years, it was standard procedure to retract the flaps immediately during a go-around. Investigators believe that under stress, Wayu reverted to these familiar procedures, a theory further supported by his earlier call for flaps 25, a setting on the Fokker 100, but not the MA-60. This type of reversion is often seen in pilots with insufficiently rigorous training. The KNKT did not deeply investigate the quality of the flight crew's training, though it noted that the pilots had not undergone required EGPWS response training. Investigators also found that the training conducted in China with interpreters could have led to poor retention of information. While the KNKT did not comment on the effectiveness of the training, the evidence suggests that the pilots were not adequately trained to operate the MA-60, as they failed to follow standard procedures for the aircraft. The investigation into the crash of Merpati Nusantara Airlines Flight 8968 failed to address many of the most troubling issues, and its recommendations offered little to improve safety. Major accidents continue to occur in West Papua, such as the 2015 crash of Trigana Air Flight 267, which exhibited many of the same deficiencies. While overall safety is improving, Trigana Air has since become the country's most dangerous major airline, following in Merpati's footsteps. Corruption remains a persistent threat to safety, and perhaps the most important lesson from this crash is that using a state-owned airline as a testing ground for questionable aircraft and leveraging Chinese loan money is not a reliable approach to ensuring passenger safety.